Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the Nautel webinar on HD radio, digital AM and FM in Canada. I'm Chuck Kelly, your host for this webinar, and I am delighted and honored to be joined by a dream team panel today, and I'd like to introduce all of these folks to you. Be hard-pressed to find a more knowledgeable bunch on the subject of today's webinar. First, Mr. Gary Manteuffel is the Director of U.S. and Canadian National Accounts for Nautel. Welcome, Gary.
Hi, Chuck.
We have Mr. Jeff Detweiler, Executive Director of Xperi, the developers of HD radio. Hey, Jeff.
Hi, Chuck. Thanks for having us.
We're glad you're here. And Kirk Nesbitt is here, the Technical Advisor of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. Hi, Kirk.
Yes, hello, everyone.
Welcome. And last but not least, Mr. Paul Brenner, the Executive Officer of Emmis Communications, here to talk about data services and the traffic rollout in broadcast traffic consortium for HD radio. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Chuck. Thanks for including me today.
We're glad you're here. So we're going to just briefly talk about this agenda. We're going to talk about the regulatory issues. Where does that stand in Canada? We're going to talk about the Canadian Association of Broadcasters' role, traffic data in the HD rollout, the status of HD radio in Canada, the numbers of radios equipped with HD. Of course, the receivers were a limiting factor for digital radio in the past and not so much anymore. So we're going to hear some good news about that. We're going to talk about implementing HD radio in your station and the kind of choices you've got relative to bandwidth and audio channels and traffic information. And last but not least, we're going to take your questions. So you'll note that in the application that you've entered here, there's a place where you can click on that and type in a question. And please do that at any time. We will be answering the questions at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time, we will answer them offline, but everybody will get an answer to their questions. So please do ask your questions. And remember that the completion of this webinar qualifies you for a half of an SBE recertification credit, according to the SBE Certification Committee. So we're glad to offer that. Kirk, tell us a little bit about the regulatory status of HD radio in Canada.
I will. Thank you, Chuck. I want to first congratulate Nautel for organizing this webinar now, because I think it is really timely. The CRTC, our broadcast regulator, had released a policy a number of years ago, 2014, that allowed a flexible approach to give broadcasters an opportunity to innovate and experiment with HD radio, and a number of stations have been doing that and growing over the last number of years. And our spectrum regulator, ISED, has permitted experimental authorization of HD radio, and to do so, licensees apply to ISED with an engineering brief to confirm no interference to adjacent operations. And in addition, broadcasters must write to the CRTC to explain what type of programming that they'll be carrying on their services, if they're carrying additional multicast services on HD2 and HD3 services.
Thank you, Kirk. That sounds very involved. Is it risky? Has anybody been turned down?
No, to my knowledge, nobody has been denied an experimental authorization, and it's just a matter of their rules that these experimental licenses have a one-year term, but it's just a matter of a simple notification to ISED to extend that on an ongoing basis.
Sounds good. Okay, very good. Tell us about the CAB.
Yes, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters has been getting very involved in HD radio planning in the last number of years, and in particular targeting 4 issues. We are working with our ratings service Numeris to set up a test and measurement plan to actually measure the penetration and growth of HD radio listening in Canada. We're working through the costing details and the technical requirements right now, and my hope, although no specific date has been set, my hope is that we can get some testing launched by the fall. In addition, on the technical side, we've been working closely with ISED through the RABC, that's the Radio Advisory Board of Canada, and working with establishing a set of lab measurements, which ISED has agreed, and they've engaged the Communication Research Council to conduct those measurements that will allow us to properly identify the interference protection ratios that would be needed across Canada to set the stage for adoption of HD radio as a voluntary standard in Canada. So we're looking forward to that test program. It is just starting now, and we expect results from that to also be available in the fall. The third item we're targeting is to consult with the CRTC regarding a digital radio policy, and that's very timely. The Government of Canada has just announced yesterday that it is conducting a review of the Broadcasting Act, and just prior to that, the CRTC released a report on the future distribution models for broadcasting, for radio and television. So it's opened the door that we can have a really fulsome conversation with policymakers about how to get this right for the future. Mm-hmm. And the fourth area that we're interested in is to understand the future license fee structure as an industry, so that we have a full understanding and predictability for the future. Another area that we're quite interested in is to monitor HD radio developments in regard to including hybrid radio. Hybrid radio is where you have a wireless internet back channel to allow for interactive and enhanced content to support your radio broadcast. And we're interested in how receivers may develop in the next generation of HD radio receivers that will include exciting features such as service following to allow for handoff between digital and analog services, and also to streaming services, and other exciting features of being able to tune a radio receiver by logo rather than by frequency.
That's great. Okay, so a lot of this is kind of keeping up with the online streaming stuff. I mean, there's so much sophistication going on in that industry today. This allows radio really to catch up.
Yes, and to converge. We're seeing all of these multiple platforms that entertainment is being distributed on converging into a consistent set of experiences.
That's great, Kirk. Thank you very much. Let's see if I can advance the slide here. Mr. Detweiler, there are people already asking, how is HD radio doing around the world?
It's doing great. We're up to about 50 million receivers worldwide now. About 2.1 million of those are in Canada. So it's early days, but it's having great success. It's about 2,200 stations on the FM band worldwide, and about 220 AM broadcasting digitally. And we're getting ready to launch the first all-digital AM here in Frederick, Maryland. So that's a new activity that I forgot to include in my slides. But we have the technology adopted in the U.S. There are a number of other countries that are either conditionally approving, like Romania, and those that are testing and interested in the technology, understanding if it's appropriate for their country and whether it fits within their regulatory environment. And of course, Canada has been approved for experimentation and innovation, and we've been enjoying working with Kirk's group, the CAB, and they've been most helpful in helping us understand the inner workings of the regulatory process and how we're able to navigate those waters. It's It's certainly been interesting to participate with the RABC in understanding how all of that came to be. Next slide.
Okay.
So specifically in Canada, there are 18 stations that have converted to the technology. They cover 10 markets: Ajax, Calgary, Hamilton, Markham, Montreal, Ottawa, Surrey, Toronto, Vancouver, and Woodstock. There are about 45 digital channels that are on the air. We've had I think reasonable success for the short time that digital radio is rolled out in Canada, covering a number of the provinces. We still need some experiences in the prairies and the Maritimes, and but I'm pretty happy with where things are going so far, and radio stations are experimenting with a lot of new programming.
Okay.
So to that end, we have the multicultural radio stations are able to now deliver content where they previously were limited to their main channel, where they had to choose across 20 different languages what programming to offer in a day part. Well, now with the multicast channels, the HD2s, HD3, and HD4 channels, they're able to dedicate full-time services on many of those channels and improve the listener experience of radio for that specific market segment. So other radio stations, like the more mainstream, larger broadcaster, they have elected to use HD2s and 3s by giving a preferential place for their AM broadcast. So many of the large broadcasters are taking their AMs that were suffering signal impact in the major metro areas and are now afforded a good quality signal that's being transmitted digitally on FM, and gives that radio station a new voice in town.
Excellent.
As far as the specific brands that have rolled out in Canada, we've got 33 auto brands that have introduced the technology. About half of them have it as standard equipment in Canada. As I mentioned briefly, we have a little bit over 2.1 million cars that are on the road in Canada. And as of this year to date, 38% of the cars that were sold in Canada have come equipped with HD radio technology in them.
That's coming right along.
We're excited about it, and we're hearing every day from each of the auto brands about wanting to know who is broadcasting now. They're anxious to test in new markets, and so we see a lot of activity from the auto brands. Just to back up a little bit for those who may be new to this conversation of digital radio, HD radio is something that's called an in-band on-channel, sometimes often called an adjacent channel technology, but it's all within the emission mask limits that were assigned to the radio stations. In the US, it's the FCC, and around the world, it targets on the ITU emission masks, but it's fully compliant with those. And we are able to adjust the sideband power levels to meet any protection and emission limits that are required. So it's a very flexible system, and it allows the stations to transmit both the analog and the digital simultaneously. The advantage being all of the existing analog receivers out there continue to work and receive programming the way they have. For those who have one of the new digital receivers, they get all the enhanced services, the HD2s, 3, and 4s. They get image support for cover art images along with the song title and artist of the songs that are playing, or an image of the host and the station logos, all of which are bringing about a much richer environment for the consumer. And so we're pretty excited about what this can mean for Canada. It's certainly finding great success in the States.
One thing that this slide brings to mind, Jeff, that I've always thought was a huge advantage is the robustness of HD digital radio, and the fact that the digital sidebands on the lower frequency side have basically redundant information with the digital sideband on the upper frequency side. So if you get some distortion or noise or some sort of problem on one side, the receiver just keeps on going.
That's correct. It's not only redundant, but it's also spectrally inverted, so that what's close to the analog signal on one side band is out on the outside on the other. Therefore, the nature of analog into digital interference or digital into analog interference is minimized.
That's right. That's right. Okay, great.
So what does it take to put a digital signal on? Well, in the very basic sense, you need a transmitter that's capable of transmitting the HD radio waveform. It is essentially an AM modulated signal you're adding to your FM signal, and as a result, you're going to need some additional headroom and capacity in that, and it's a much broader bandwidth signal. So the transmitters that typically would be a Class C FM are optimized, biased either Class AB or potentially Class A as well for operation with HD. You would need to have the layer 1 exciter engine, the part that actually generates the OFDM waveform, and you'll need the exporter, which generates the main channel encoding of your analog replication for digital. For any of the added data services, that being an HD2, 3, or 4, traffic data services, station logos, and image art, you need to have an HD radio importer. Now, fortunately, manufacturers like Nautel are now bringing the exporter and importer products together into one package and offering it at a price point that was afforded only to one of those components before. So the costs are coming down quite a bit, and the setup and complexity has been reduced greatly.
Very good.
HD radio is a very flexible platform. We have a number of broadcast modes. Mode MP1, which has 96 kilobits per second of capacity. Mode MP3, which is adds an additional 24 kilobits per second of capacity to that. We also have a mode called MP11, which is a future mode that will add yet another 24 kilobits. But let's just focus on what is deployed right now. Typically, a radio station will take that first MP1 partition, called the P1 partition, and divide it into several broadcast channels. Here in the States and those who've deployed in Canada, typically that main channel signal is run at about 48 kilobits per second. That affords a quality of signal better than FM, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to break up that additional bandwidth into HD2, 3, or even HD4 signals. If you're a member of one of the traffic service offerings, that additional capacity can be used for those data services. And Paul will hopefully touch on that a little bit later on the conversation.
Very good.
So HD radio is about improving the user experience of radio in the vehicle and at home. So certainly features like artist and song title and album name are very basic. You have that with RDS. HD radio does a better job of delivering that content without all the errors and stoppage of the data. You also then have the ability to not only have that information on the main channel, but you can have it on all of the multicast channels, along with, crystal clear digital audio, and now artist experience, the ability to send cover art images, station logos, and advertiser logos along with the programming. So it's an enhanced user experience and offers that compelling digital radio experience everyone wants to have, like all of the streaming services and connected services they're becoming used to.
Very good.
So here's an example of a dashboard in a Toyota where you have the cover art image for One Direction, and you also will see here on this a display that the HD logo has a 1 and a 2 after that. That indicates that you have a main channel and an HD2 available on that radio station.
So additional content that you wouldn't have had any other way.
Correct. This would be a blank screen if you're analog.
Yep. And if I was doing navigation, it could potentially be on this same receiver if this was a navigation enabled receiver. Oh, it has a map card.
Yep, they split the screen down. You have your map on one side, and you have your enhanced digital radio experience on the other side.
Excellent. Okay.
So we talked about how radio stations can break up the channels. Here's how a radio station in Oklahoma City, for example, is taking their one broadcast signal, and on their analog and their HD1, their primary format is a sports talk targeted at men 18 to 49. On HD2, they've elected to have a classic rock format where they're going after adults 35-64. On HD3, they have a niche format of Spanish oldies targeting Hispanic community 35 to 64. And on HD4, it's a news talk targeting men 25 to 54. So that one radio station now has diversified its offering to a much broader demographic of advertisers and listeners.
And yet they only have one sales department, or they only need one sales department. So they're not increasing the competitiveness in the market necessarily.
Nor are they cannibalizing their own audience.
That's right. The analog signal, if you don't have an HD radio signal, it sounds exactly the same.
That's right.
An HD radio receiver, I mean. Yeah. Very good. Thank you. Now, my good friend from the Broadcast Traffic Consortium, can you tell us about data services?
Hi, Chuck. You guys hear me okay?
Oh, yeah, sounds good.
Good. Yeah, sure. I'll just take a few minutes. I think Jeff did a really nice job setting up this conversation. There's quite a bit of backstory and technology that supports what we've enabled. We're essentially a provider of services that reside on top of all the things that Jeff just walked through. I've been involved in HD radio since 2004. One of the original broadcasters of about 14 that helped bring that to the market with Ubiquity. Emmis Communications was one of those companies. In 2007, I approached a group of broadcast leaders that at the time, way before Jeff's review of all the great things that people do with HD radio, people really weren't quite sure what to do with all this new bandwidth and multicast and things. So I formed this group focused on a strategy that the HD radio bandwidth could be a data service, utilizing HD radio, Ubiquity's technology, software, intellectual property to transport not audio, but data. And so what we did is form this company that uses the content from here, who powers Bing.com and most maps in the vehicle, originally called Navtech, if you remember the name of Navtech. And we formed this end-to-end system where we have a network of broadcasters that take a feed of data into their importer, which Jeff showed earlier. It packetizes that for data broadcast, and the receivers on the other end are navigation devices, not audio. And so that's what we created. We currently provide traffic, weather, fuel, prices, navigation, integration like you've seen at the top of the picture, integrated color-coded streets for traffic flow, incidents in a market, driver suggestions. We also do static maps that are not navigation. So we will send weather-related images, fuel prices, even traffic maps that have no navigation in the car. So we've been doing that for a while. And in Canada, we launched in 2015. We have several broadcasters that are on board with us. We'd always take more if you want to reach out to us. The network is always growing. We have partnerships in place today, dating back many years now with Mercedes, Audi, Mitsubishi, Honda, Acura, Hyundai, Kia. These are all folks that looked at the value proposition of delivering this service over satellite versus mobile like an IP connection or HD radio data services, and we have won out on all of those automakers that I just described to you, because the value proposition of essentially free to broadcast and only having to charge a small fee to the automaker is much more palatable than the ongoing fees of a satellite subscription or the monthly data cost of an IP or a mobile connection. So the original strategy of offering HD radio as an innovation to automakers and OEMs has really come true. It's taken 10 years to get there. We've moved into Canada over the last few years, and again, we'd love to have more participants if you want to reach out.
Thank you, Paul. A couple of things. One thing that I really like about this is that it tends to solve a conundrum that broadcasters often have, especially in major metropolitan areas where during the morning drive and the evening drive, the most popular content, if you will, is traffic announcements, but they're rather boring and they tend to take away from the normal programming. So now you can have it both. You can have your music or whatever you're listening to, news programming or whatever, and the traffic information automatically shows up graphically right on your map, which is where you want it. That's wonderful.
With updates more frequently, about every 30 seconds.
Yeah. So the other question I've got is, what is the cost of this? In other words, how much bandwidth does this chew up?
So Jeff went through the model before, that there's a 96 and a 120 kilobit. 120 is more popular. When we go into partnerships, we ask for around 13 kilobits per second of data allocated to this service. That, as in many markets in the United States, Jeff would attest, are carrying their main channel and probably two other multicast stations along with this data. So it isn't a level that impacts a station's decisions around multicast content, but it's at a level that can easily carry all of these graphical services available. In contrast, which is an interesting question, Chuck, we launched this as an RDS service, an FM RDS service originally, and the bandwidth capacity of FM RDS for this service is 700 bits per second. And we're able to use 13 kilobits per second for the HD radio solution.
Yeah. Okay.
Quite a
Very
bit
good.
faster.
Yeah. Well, that's great. That helps a lot.
Chuck, I wanted to add one point here is that as broadcasters think about whether digital radio is right for them or not, I think they should consider that there is a connected radio future where connected cars are going to need lots of content. And the vehicle of HD radio is a great way to deliver one-to-many data to the connected vehicle. And to be a player in that, you're going to need to be a participant in the digital radio future.
There's no question this is the way that radio is going to go. And this is, one of the things that's interesting about radio is it's been a chameleon over the years. When television came out, everybody thought radio was dead. And radio grew and advanced and adapted itself, and now it's doing it again. So it's fascinating to see and how HD radio particularly is playing a role in allowing radio to compete against a myriad of services that didn't exist just 20 years ago. Very good. Okay, so let's talk about, just for a second, what do we do to actually take a station to digital radio? I'm assuming that a number of the people, and by the way, there's over 120 people logged on here. I'm really, really happy about this, especially for a webinar that's geographically restricted. So, what are the basics? What do you need to know in order to take and put your radio station on the air? And well, as Jeff said, in FM analog, the transmitter amplifiers are operating in Class C. But for HD radio, they need to be rebiased for more linear operation. And the analog and the digital channels are all contained in the single radio channel, in the normal bandwidth, which contains the analog and the digital representation of the analog, plus up to 4 additional channels. And the digital carriers can be set to about between 10 and 20 dB below the analog signal, depending on the regulations in your market. In the United States, almost all stations can get to 14 dB. Many stations can actually do 10 dB below the analog carrier. And you can have, in the US, you can have asymmetrical sidebands. That is, the lower frequency sideband can either be lower or higher in amplitude relative to the upper frequency sideband. And generally, there's no impact on your antenna. You can use the same antenna from the analog installation.
Chuck, if I can just add in quickly there.
Sure.
The work that the CAB and the Radio Advisory Board have been doing over the past months have updated the ISED experimental rules to permit the same flexibility in Canada for experimentation of up to -10 dB power levels and asymmetrical operation as well.
That's great. It would be really nice, if the rules were similar north and south of the border, as they are north and south of the border with Mexico, for that matter.
So those recommendations are in ISED's hands now, and we're waiting for their response.
Excellent. I could put a plug in for NABA, the North American Broadcasters Association, that is also working to make sure that digital radio all moves forward in the future. Let's talk about the specific features of the Nautel GV series. This is not your grandfather's transmitter. The efficiency has gotten so much better in the last 10 years. With the GV40, the efficiency is, or all the GV transmitters, the efficiency is far, far better than it used to be. And we can have far higher digital transmitter power output than we ever saw before, because we have some power, what we call HD power boost, which is PAPR, or crest reduction, going on, intelligent and designed into the Nautel transmitters, patented by Nautel. And we have what I think is one of the coolest features, which is the HD spectrum efficiency optimizer, where the transmitter is automatically looking at the sidebands and making sure that you're being a good neighbor with regard to any interference, and it manages that while keeping its efficiency maximized. There's backup user interfaces, site control. The transmitter can even run down to 90 volts AC at 1/3 of TPO. The dynamic RDS, oscilloscopes, all sorts of technologies built in. Of course, the award-winning Nautel AUI is built in. So many features are built into these transmitters. It's a major upgrade from the transmitters that many people have known and used in the future. And one more thing I should mention, some stations may have purchased the NV Lite series, and recently we announced that many of the NV Lite transmitters are able to be upgraded for HD radio in the future. So contact Mr. Gary Manteuffel and get further information about that, upgrading an NV Lite transmitter. And this is the power levels of the individual transmitters that we have available from Nautel for the GV series, from the 3.5 kilowatts all the way up to 80 kilowatts. One thing that's interesting you can see here is that at minus 14 dB injection level, you get virtually nameplate power out of the transmitter. 20 dB, you can for sure get nameplate power out of the transmitter, but almost nameplate power at minus 14. It also shows the analog power output. One thing to bear in mind here is that when we talk about these power levels, these are the analog power that you can make while doing, for instance, minus 14, 18 kilowatts out of a GV20 at minus 14. That's the analog power, because that's what's equivalent to your analog TPO today, not the combined power. And that's a very important distinction. Make sure that if you're looking at spec pages from other manufacturers, that they're showing you the analog power that you're going to get out of the transmitter at that particular injection level. Gary, you haven't had a chance to talk much. Is there something you'd like to add at this point?
I did want to mention we've got quite a number of customers there throughout Canada that have our product. In fact, 90% of the stations that are broadcasting right now in HD radio have Nautel transmitters.
That's excellent.
The other thing too is mentioned, in addition to the GV series, we also have the VS series that are HD compatible. So actually all of our FM transmitter line is HD radio compatible and upgradable. So just wanted to point that out as well.
Thank you, Gary. Well, we do have fortunately quite a number. Well, one more thing I wanted to mention here. So the Nautel importer exporter have been consolidated, and the HD Multicast Plus is now available, which combines both the importer and the exporter into a single box, and reduces the cost, as Jeff mentioned, considerably, and is making the installation, probably more importantly, making the installation so much simpler. It used to be very complicated, and now it's getting to be rather simple to install HD radio in your station. So as I mentioned, we do have quite a number of questions. Thank you all for bringing up your questions, and I'm going to pose them to the panel as we speak. First one was from Adrian. He asks, how many experimental licenses are in Canada now? And I think he's mentioned, Jeff, I think it was 18, is that right?
Well, there's 18 stations that have already converted. I know of another 7 that have applied. So whether that's the total number of those who have actually applied, it would be difficult for me to say. Kirk, do you have any other visibility into that?
No, as you mentioned, Jeff, there are a few stations that have experimental licenses in the pipe. They just haven't got them launched and on air yet. And of the existing 18 stations, I think you mentioned that includes actually about 45 services when you count up all of the HD2 and HD3 services.
Right. One thing I should mention here is there was a significant software upgrade that was occurring at ISED this past year that tended to stall a lot of activity for a while. So unfortunately, we're on the other side of that now, and applications are being processed a lot faster. But it did tend to slow things down for the better part of a year.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Another question comes from Dave. He says, is the lack of HD experimental stations on the prairies due to the low population density and the economies of scale that would be needed to make it effective to the majority of the prairie population? Who would like to tackle that one? Crickets.
Well, so I can jump in here, Chuck. I think it's only natural that some of the largest markets have experimented with HD radio first, but we have seen that begin to expand. And in addition, there's a similar correlation to what Paul was describing about the traffic services from BTC, that it has been targeting the largest markets first.
Sure. Sure, and I know there are some very high-powered stations out on the prairies. This could allow those stations to take the investment they're already making in broadcasting and analog and add additional content channels that may not be easily heard out in the prairies. So it could be very valuable.
I would gladly add data services in those prairies if people had HD radio transmitters.
There you go. There you go. Okay, John. Go ahead.
It's an area where many of the indigenous people live, and it would be a way to serve those communities a lot better with more diverse programming.
Yep, the costs of operation for those additional subchannels is very, very small. So you might be able to easily cost justify a channel as a subchannel rather than putting an additional radio station on the air. Very, very useful point. There's a question from John. Any suggestions of audio processing for classical on HD2? What are people doing with audio processing, Jeff?
Well, my recommendation would be to look at processing that was primarily designed for IP audio streaming rather than over-the-air analog FM broadcast as its fundamental design. Certainly, those processors are optimized for low bitrate audio. Typically, the multicast channels are going to be running certainly sub 48. Probably the majority are running at 32 or lower, between 32 and 24. I would certainly look for those that have shown a proficiency at being able to deal with IP stream audio at those rates.
Another question for the panel as a whole. Mark asks, we've been talking all about FM HD, but has there been any interest in AM HD in Canada? Again, crickets.
No, just thank you for the question. That's what you're supposed to say when you need a few seconds to think. There hasn't been, to my knowledge, a great deal of interest expressed in AM HD radio in Canada so far. Some of the potential challenges around it relate to skywave interference at night that can change the performance of HD radio on AM at nighttime versus daytime. But certainly from a CAB perspective, we are focusing first on FM HD radio and really looking to this new government review of the Broadcasting Act and the CRTC policy review related to that to find a pathway for AM into new digital platforms.
Okay, very good. Couple for Paul here. How does this BTC mapping info compare to GPS, and which is the first station in Canada using BTC services?
That's a good question. GPS is a receiver side technology. So essentially, we broadcast data that is generally generic to a metropolitan area. It's regionalized or segmented in a way that makes it easier for the car to process. But the GPS makes the content we send to the vehicle very specific to that location. So we code to GPS. We make sure that the locations of the content we have are translatable by the GPS device in the car. But we don't really do anything other than rely on that GPS to display the content we have relative to the car's location.
Okay.
So that's the first. Go ahead.
One thing I've noted in comparing your service offerings as to those communicated either over satellite or some other mechanism is that you're able to offer better granularity in the market because of the capacity that you're able to focus on.
That's true. I think on a nationalized basis, satellite and typically mobile broadcast bigger sets of information. We're able to process local information because it's transmitter by transmitter in a market. So we can break that down into very localized sets of data. And to the first broadcast station on the air was a chorus station in Hamilton, outside of Toronto.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. One question for me. Are the NV series transmitters capable of HD? And absolutely they are, Dave. Thank you for that. One question from Gary says, as we know, people are aware of the existence of satellite radio, mainly Sirius XM, but how do I make my listeners aware that HD radio is available? Or is there a car automatically tuning on HD radio as they open their car radio? Do they have to sign in or anything? Jeff?
Typically speaking, it should be an automatic function, assuming the HD radio feature is turned on in the vehicle. Many of the early deployments in Canada, because the technology hadn't been rolled out initially, were sent and shipped in with it turned off. But if you have that turned on your vehicle, and it's usually one of the submenu selections, it will acquire your analog signal initially, transition immediately to the HD1 digital signal, and then a simple tune-up on the dial will take you to the HD2, and then the next tune-up will take you to HD3, and if it's there, an HD4, or many of the receivers with the touch screens allow you to select them independently. And you can certainly set a multicast channel in as a preset, but as a rule, once the vehicle is set up for HD radio reception, there's no login required, nothing, no fees, no subscriptions to deal with, no logins. It's just simply free radio as we've come to love.
Free over-the-air broadcast. It's what we all made our career on. Wonderful.
If I could add to that,
go ahead. Yeah.
If I could add to that, just that's why I mentioned earlier our interest in what the next generation of receivers will include in its feature set. Because, for example, having the ability to tune stations by radio station logo makes that experience that much easier, and station discovery so much easier for the listener. Some stations that are experimenting with AM simulcast on their FM HD radio station have found a bit of a challenge in educating their audience of just how do you package a promo on the air that makes that simple to explain.
That's great. Thank you, Kirk.
I should put one plug in also for Paul and Tag Station and what they've brought to that marketplace position. We've partnered with them to deliver that in North America with DTS Connected Radio, which is, I believe, part of what Kirk's talking about here, and the ability to tune stations by logo or by content, and having that rich meta information and image support that we all want for the center stack of the vehicle.
That's great. tremendous amount of information, and there's been so much interest. We've had probably another 30 questions that we couldn't get to, but we will answer offline. We will answer these questions to everybody. I want to thank so much our Dream Team panel today, Gary Manteuffel, Jeff Detweiler, Kirk Nesbitt, and not the least of which, Mr. Paul Brenner. Thank you all so much for adding so much to this webinar. The email addresses, I'm deliberately leaving them on the screen here so that you can reach all of these gentlemen. And I want to thank everybody for being a part of this today. And this webinar will be recorded, has been recorded, and will be put up on the Nautel website for if you want to watch it again at a later date. Thanks so much, everybody, and good day.